Австралийн хүмүүс ялгаа. Welcome.
За сайн байцгаана уу хүн төлөвчтэй. Өнөөдөр ороо манай дефактоны нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор ноён профессор Дон Дрaммонд гэж хүн оролцож байна. Энэ хүн Канадын сангийн яамны дэд сайд байсан. Мөн томоохон Канадын Торонто домен гэж банкны дэд ерөнхийлөгч байсан хүн юм аа.
Дон Друммонд Канад улсын Бритиш Коломбиа мужийн төв Викториа хотод төрж өссөн бөгөөд Викториагийн Их Сургуулийг төгссөн. Дараагаар нь Тэрээр Квинс Их Сургуульд Эдийн засгийн чиглэлээр мастерын зэрэг хамгаалсан. Тэрээр Квинс Их Сургуулийн гол илтгэгч бөгөөд тус сургуулийн улс төр судлал ба Олон Улсын бодлогын Мэттью-ийн зөвлөлийн дэд профессороор ажиллаж байна. Тэрээр Тэд банкнд 2000 оны 6 дугаар сард ахлах дэд ерөнхийлөгч ба ахлах эдийн засгчаар ажиллаж эхэлсэн бөгөөд 2010 оны хүртэл тус банкнд ажиллаж байсан. Үүний дараагаар тэрээр Олон Улсын эдийн засгийн тавцанд зөвлөгөө өгөх, илтгэл тавих ажлаа үргэлжлүүлсээр байсан. Ноён Друммонд 2010 оны 6 дугаар сараас Квинс Их Сургуульд Мэттью-ийн шин зөвлөлийн гишүүн Эрдэмтэн зочноор ажиллах болсон.
Good evening.
Good evening.
What brought you to Mongolia?
Well, I was approached by the Canadian Embassy in Beijing to come and they have a series called Talking Economics. And they asked me if I would do a few talks there. And that ultimately ended up as 3 cities in China. And then as the various embassies were discussing this program, that other embassies in Southeast Asia asked me to come there. And that then brought me to Mongolia and then South Korea and Singapore and Tokyo and Taipei.
We were so happy to see you at the Economic Club of Ulaanbaatar
Thank
as
you.
a guest speaker. And you have mentioned about impossibility to have all the time very high growth rate in particular countries that have a lot of natural resources. Why is that so?
Well, natural resources will always be highly cyclical. First of all, the demand for the natural resources themselves will depend on how the global economy is growing, but they're always at the margin. And you'll find just a very small change in demand or supply for natural resources. For example, a 1% change in the demand for a natural resource could easily change the price by 10%. And
Wow.
so if you look at the history of the price of iron ore, the price of coal, the price of oil, you'll find that they double sometimes, they drop in half sometimes, and they go all over the place.
1% in demand may change 10%
10% in price, because
That's
the pricing is
what's
always bid at the margin.
That's what's happening now
Exactly.
in China and the relations to Mongolia. Our coal price went down quite well.
Well, we have the same experience in Canada. So for example, natural gas prices in 2005 were $13 per BTU. In the last couple of years, they've averaged $3. So less than 1/4 the price it was just a small number of years ago.
And the same happening now with current changes in U.S. with the this oil shale, all the structure, everything in supply of energy, coal, gas, oil, is being changed. What happened? What's happening?
It's fascinating because everybody always focuses on the demand side. And so you have these very strongly held views of peak supply, everything's going to run out. I remember shortly before I began studying economics, in 1970, the Sierra Club put out a book and said within 30 years there won't be literally no resources left anywhere in the world. And every single natural resource today, there's a larger known supply than there was in 1970. And the biggest revolution that's occurred in the last couple of years is exactly what you said, with fracking and natural gas and oil. And that's not necessarily a good thing for Canada, because we've set up our oil and natural gas to export to the United States. The United States is almost self-sufficient in oil and may well have a surplus in natural gas that they may be looking to export. And this has all really happened in the last 5 or 6 years with new technological developments.
May it happen in China, in not maybe shale ways, but differently somehow the structure is completely changed. They don't need much
Well,
coke and coal we sell them.
Well, first of all, just basically look at the intent of the Chinese government is to move their economy away from investment and exports towards a consumption-based economy, which will move it in good part away from goods production towards the consumption of services. Well, just imagine the content of natural resources in an economy that's dominated by consumption as opposed to being dominated by industrial production and by machinery equipment. So they don't need as much, they will not be consuming as much natural resources in the future if they are successful at making that economic
Before
transition.
going that from the investment-driven economy in China, making a lot of infrastructure, etc. Now then more urbanization is happening. More people, 100 million or so people are to move to the city, which will demand new also infrastructure, housing, cars, all demand metal and iron. Then it demands coal. Then how is it connected with consumption? Or you mean consumption also means urbanization?
Well, it'll be the citizens themselves will consume more than they're consuming now. They've always had a high savings rate, but they will buy more consumer goods. Part of that will be cars, and of course that will require some industrial materials and steel and the like of it, but a lot of it will be more based upon services, which will be very low level of intensity for natural resources. But you know, the one thing you can count on in the natural resource space is it will be completely different in 10 years than it is today. It could be favorable, or it could completely change from the demand or the supplies. It's constantly evolving, which is why, of course, you're very vulnerable if you have a high dependence on that one particular sector.
Yeah, we have very much so. And what would be the best way out for Mongolia if it is like this that we're talking about happening in China?
I would say there's two steps. One is to stay with the strength of natural resources, but to evolve the development of natural resources. So for example, in Canada, because we have ample supplies of petroleum, we have a very large petrochemical industry. So it's diversification, but it's not completely out of the field. Upgrading, refining, developing mining equipment, for example, because this is where the mining is actually put into place. This is where the knowledge of what kind of equipment may be going, perhaps being a leader in the development of mining equipment, excavation equipment, and the like.
Yeah, it's also because Canada is all around. Your mining logistics services, your investors, your mining companies are all around the world, and logically you can supply them with high quality equipment, logistic things. In case of Mongolia being a small 3 million people, just relying on China, which is volatile as we have talked, what would be the other exit, do you think?
Well,
in terms of diversification of economy?
Well, everybody, when they diversify their economy and try to move up the value-added chain, of course they think about manufacturing, but we have to think about that very carefully because Mongolia is not particularly a low-cost area. It doesn't have the huge economies of scale that a 1.3 billion person population in China does. So if it moves into manufacturing, it'd have to be very much in niche markets where it has a comparative advantage. It also requires a very particular type of education system. I would say Mongolia has the first requirement, a very strong primary sector. I think there's 16 universities here, it's strong in the universities, but it requires an education system that's geared towards innovation, because you can only go so far by just doing the same manufacturing as everybody else does.
Yes.
If you want to be successful, then you can only do it if you're cheap on the labor. You got to innovate and do something different.
There should be something creative, not necessarily of industrial scale.
You have to create, this is something we struggle to in Canada because we have a very high level of education. We have the highest percentage of people in any developed country taking some form of post-secondary education, but we're not necessarily fostering the same type of innovation, certainly not at the rate you see in the United States. There are many other things you might say you don't like about the US economy, but they do have a strong sense of entrepreneurship and the fostering of innovation, constantly trying new things. Even if they fail at them, they will keep trying again.
So with the current path of speed of path of globalization in the world, Mongolians, some of our politicians said that we better go deeper into the value chain. Maybe we will produce iron ore, then the other and other, higher and higher in the value chain, and then we will supply China. But yet China has all this infrastructure for that value chain. What would be the a smart way or better way for Mongolia? Should we go in that line, creating new industry complexes, or what you would take?
I think it has to try some form of diversification, because I think that the risks are too great otherwise. The real prices, we had a period of very strong commodity prices for the first 8 years of 2000, but other than that, virtually every commodity price in the world, in real terms, adjusted by general inflation, have been on a downward basis.
Okay.
So it doesn't seem like a best bet to stay isolated in that one particular basis. There has to be an attempt at some kind of diversification.
Okay.
Welcome.
Look, you have been a very extended long-term experience in our terms, Ministry of Finance, your Department of Finance. Let's talk about a little bit of financing the development. In Mongolia being a small country, huge territory, and we need infrastructure, we need a road, and when the foreign investment a little bit withdrawn due to several policy changes, several factors, the current government had decided to borrow more money,
right?
And we have $1.5 billion bond called Chinggis Khan bond, and about $300 million samurai bond denominated in yen. So obviously we have to pay in 3 years from now, but they now mostly using for road,
right?
And this sort of infrastructure that cannot pay immediately,
right?
What is the best way?
I think there's no problem for borrowing infrastructure that has a clear dividend to pay back, but as you said, roads doesn't qualify for that. The difficulty with the government borrowing that's leading to a high fiscal deficit is it's transferring into a high international deficit as well. And those international debt obligations are denominated in US dollars.
Yes, unlike your case
our international debt is in Canadian dollars.
In your own money, yes.
Yeah, so we still have to find investors who are willing to buy our bonds at a certain interest rate, but we don't have a situation that no one will give us access to foreign currency, which you could find yourself. But
nobody will buy in our money.
Right, but you get into a vicious circle, because coming back to this diversification process, and particularly if you want to go up the value-added chain, Canada, Mongolia, any economy has to upgrade its technology and its machinery equipment. Well, at least initially, that's almost all going to be imported.
Yep.
And as your dollar devaluates, as your currency devaluates.
You said, we need to upgrade our technology, but not by the government. Why they should buy?
No, by the private sector, but they will have to import that.
Yes.
And your currency has gone down 30% in the last year, which makes the imports more expensive, which makes it very difficult to upgrade your technology
and plus to pay back this bond.
This is why a lower value of the currency is good in the short term for competitiveness and exports, but it really makes it difficult to diversify and bring in the equipment that would upgrade the economy.
What happens in a nation that cannot or could not pay their foreign debt on time? We'll call it default, bankruptcy, whatever. Name, it doesn't matter, but what happens?
Well, we look around the global economy, because this happened lots of times. So there's two models. The first one is you declare bankruptcy, and you go through an international process of divvying up whatever assets you have to give back to the investors, and they may get 5% or 10% of their money. And that, quote unquote, solves the problem, but good luck ever borrowing again. Investors may think that they're pretty silly to have bought the debt in the first place, but they're unlikely to ever buy it again.
And plus, it will come with hesitance of borrowing to any commercial bank any private sector company.
It would spread generally to the whole economy. The second option, which we've seen in a number of different cases, is government has to introduce an extreme regime of austerity. And by that, I mean, like, they cut government spending 10, 20, 30%, and it goes on for a very long period of time. The nation has to somehow have a very large decline in their wage levels, and we've seen some countries that have experienced 20 and 30% levels declines in their wages to try to restore competitiveness to allow themselves to pay back their international obligations.
Through this austerity, You, New Zealand, who else?
Argentina would be a good
Argentina.
example. They've run into difficulty a number of times.
Yeah, what was the decrease of wages in these countries?
New Zealand's case, it wasn't that extreme because they did the restraint largely from the public sector, and at the same time they did a lot of wholesale reforms. For example, they opened up their agricultural market, which actually turned out quite well. After about 5 years of adjustment, they did quite well. Greece would be an example recently that got in, I mean, its debt to GP ratio got up to 170%. And they were paying a really high premium for the bonds. They could still access the money, but at an unacceptably high interest rate.
What's the level of rate now there?
Well, it's still saying about that 170% because they just can't seem to get their economy growing. But bondholders of Greek bonds ended up with about 30 cents on their dollar. The surprising thing is, though, they're still continuing to buy the Greek bonds.
Why would it be?
That would be a surprise to me. It wouldn't be in my portfolio, sorry to say for the Greek people, but there's tremendous risk in that. The other aspect of it is when you get to a high debt level, and I believe the debt GDP ratio, if you look at the off-borrowing in Mongolia, is in the 60 to 70% range. You get a very large percentage of all the revenue collected by the government has to be dedicated to paying interest on the public debt. And that's money that you can't do anything with. It's in a sense, it's paying for something you've already consumed.
But the problem is nobody's thinking about that today. They keep spending and nobody's thinking how we will pay it back. Otherwise, the rational mind says you better collect somewhere the money to pay, which is not the case. So when this slowly time comes, what's going to happen then?
Well, why are they doing that? The reason I think they're doing that is because
no money.
People got fixated with a very strong rate of growth until quite recently.
Yes.
I mean, that was very good. The GDP per person in Mongolia is just less than $5,000, is about 1/10 what it is in the wealthier economies around the world. And why wouldn't you want strong growth? Why wouldn't you want everybody to have higher income? So it's a very natural thing. We were growing at 10%. Let's do whatever possible to keep 10%. But how can you do that when you have literally no foreign direct investment, which was gearing your growth, and you've got relatively weak commodity prices? You can't do it on a sustainable basis. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is recognize in that global environment, growth's not going to be that strong, and there's really not much way you can get around that without creating big problems.
So we must have aside money now to collect to pay on time this debt first.
I would think so, yeah.
I will share you with interesting recent cases. Government, the proceeds from bond, they keep with our development bank, which is supposed to use it for, say, these projects we are talking about. But what happens recently is government asked that development bank, because it's so much biased or related to the government, asked them, borrow me money, I will give you a bond. So the same money used twice by one guy. How do you explain? Is there any similar phenomena happening in the world?
Not that I know of. I talked about innovation. There would be an innovation, but not necessarily a positive one.
But the problem is the innovation makes the same money 2 times expensive because this money is borrowed from here, borrowed from here. Yeah. So what is the way out? How come it happens?
Bearing in mind, I'm not an expert on the Mongolian economy.
Okay.
Bearing in mind, I've only been here for a few days, but there's one thing that totally puzzles me. And as I look at the most important development that has happened in the economy here in the last few years is the dwindling of foreign direct investment in the natural resource sector. And yes, part of that slower world growth, yes, part of it's soft commodity prices, but from what I see, a large part of it is the regulatory regime that's very uncertain. And it has been for a couple of years.
Yeah, that's the point. For natural resource-rich country, it is the key important thing is the foreign direct investment comes to the sector and takes a risk, right?
But it only comes if the rules are clear.
Yes.
The rules could be tight. As everybody says, I don't mind regulation, I don't mind rules, if you tell me what the rules are. And they're very clear, but I don't think they are clear now.
Does your government own shares in mines?
No. Our government actually used to own a large petroleum company,
Okay.
and it sold it a number of years ago. That was their last interest they've had. No, the government is not
What is
involved
the
at
rationale
all.
behind why you would not own it?
Typically the private sector would run it better. I'm not saying anything negative about the Canadian government, but it's not been renowned for running businesses. It used to own an airline, it sold that. It used to own the largest railway company, and it sold that, and they're all doing quite well.
That's Mongolia should do it now.
Well, it's difficult. You know, I worked 23 years in the government, I've worked 10 years in a bank, and it's easier in the private sector because you've got one single metric. Are you making money?
Profit.
When you're in the government, you have so many different objectives. It's hard actually to be efficient. You're trying to be fair to people. You're trying to give a break to low-income people. You're trying to hire these people. You're trying to do this. You're trying to do that, and you don't end up running the corporation very well at all.
The same with Australia happens. About the same line what they had.
Well,
government larger than smaller.
Well, the largest province in Canada, Ontario, was in quite a bit of fiscal difficulty a few years ago, and they asked me to chair a commission to advise them how to get a problem. And they own some big entities. They own all the power generation. They own all of the liquor outlets, for example.
Okay.
And they run them really badly, and they get money from them.
Liquor shops.
Yeah, no, they control. They have a monopoly on the liquor. But they control the number that they have. They tell them what they can sell, what they can't sell. There's no doubt to me, if you were running that in a private business, you would make a lot more money from it and do a lot better than the government. But the government is, you know, for example, they actually have the control on licensed gambling as well, and they force the licensed gambler to have two headquarters. Well, why two headquarters? Because they want to be represented in the west part of the province as well as the central part of the province. You know, they have two casinos in one of the cities, and that's because they're employing a lot of people in the city, but it loses money. You know, no private sector company would do that.
So you sold everything afterwards?
I would say that it's on the right path, but it's going to be, it's going to take a number of years for them to get out of the problem.
Here, our government says, because they want to take care of poor people, they say, or low-income people, they restrict price per electric power.
Yeah.
And now all our power stations are in big red.
Yeah.
They have a big debt to coal miners.
Yeah.
And coal miners are waiting some subsidy from the government.
Yeah.
That virtuous circle all the time goes. We got very cheap energy.
So
what happens now? What happens after?
As we were talking about our lunch event, the advantage of being in a small country in a big world, whether you're Canada or Mongolia, is everything you think of, everything you do has been done by somebody before. So what you're talking about right now has been done all over the world, including in Canada, and everybody's proven it's an inefficient way of doing it. You should full cost price to everybody, and you have concerns about the income distribution, you deal with that via credits back to the people. And so everybody pays the full cost of electricity. It makes the company be efficient. They're efficient in their use. If you subsidize somebody artificially at a low price, they're never going to be efficient in the use.
Exactly.
And if you have a family that can't afford it, well, then you use your income and your income redistribution mechanism to flow money back to that family.
To
but
those
in general,
families,
not
yes.
for specifically for electricity.
Right, exactly. So what happens, what would be the power supply consistency guarantee if we cannot make a sort of competition there? Because naturally power supply could be, I mean, not everybody can supply. So what do you do in that sense?
Well, you always have natural monopolies in something like power. There's not a country that has very much competition.
Yes. What can we do?
You always tend to have some form of regulation. As I said, in the case of Ontario, the government actually owns it. They don't own a lot of business, but they actually own the power. There's a proposal at the moment to keep the ownership of the power generation in the hands of the government, but to sell off the distribution part of it and create competition in the distribution part. But you know, I said we learned a lesson that you don't subsidize people on the price. There is a 10% credit given to everybody in Ontario on their electricity consumption, and it's in place till 2016. So on the one hand, we're saying to people, be efficient in your use, we're trying to reduce it. And on the other hand, we're giving you a 10% break in the price. It makes no sense. So everybody makes bad policy mistakes. I don't really look around the world, and whether it's health or electricity, to see anybody really doing good things at government policy.
So what would be the dialogue or actions in this country could be to challenge this sort of price control, this sort of government ownership, inefficient management, what you would think, or what was happening in similar countries where this one happening?
You know, as an economist, we're always trained from the beginning that economic planning is not good, it's inefficient, but I think there's some elements where you do need planning. I think, you know, what do you do? I think it begins with a dialogue with the people in Mongolia. Here's where we are. We've done okay, but we're highly dependent on one sector. We're not likely to do well in the future by staying there. We have to change. And put out some ideas for people of what a Mongolia will look like in 5, 10, or 15 years, and put out the ideas why you can't keep subsidizing everything, why you don't necessarily want the public ownership. You don't have to immediately act. I think when the time I was in the government, I think the thing that impressed me the most is we had a change in government in 1984. And the new government had a very particular idea how they wanted to change the Canadian economy. And they started with a discussion document. It was called the Agenda for Economic Renewal. And it went through in quite some detail how they wanted to change the economy, and particularly the government's role in the economy. In fact, it was in that document that they proposed establishing a free trade agreement with the United States, which was heresy in Canada. We had always had strong protective barriers. It was hugely controversial, but Canada really had a national debate for about 2 or 3 years around that document, and eventually Canadians came to embrace that in a modern globalized economy, these were some of the things they needed to do. And then one by one, the government started to implement the ideas they've been proposed. So, and we had the same thing. Then we had another change in the government in 1993, and the first thing that government did was put out 2 books. They put out a plan for how they wanted to change the economy, and they put out a second plan for what it meant for fiscal policy, taxation and government spending. And it allowed those to be out in the public domain for quite some time before they started to act. They had cross-country consultations, they had roundtables in all the major cities, and heard everybody's complaints about them, and I won't say everybody agreed with it, but there was a certain basis of consensus built up, and then the government acted.
Very on time, I think, from Mongolia comment. How long it took a time to, if there was any change in the government during this long-term dialogue?
Well, those documents, when the governments came in, it took us about 4 months to, you know, as bureaucrats, we didn't change. We don't change bureaucracy in Canada when the government changed. So the government came in.
Which is not the case here.
No,
they changed completely.
That's a problem itself, because that will take longer in the process. So we worked for about 4 months in both those cases with a new government. You know, here's your ideas. Here's what we think of your ideas. We interacted, and when we put them out in the public. In the case of the Agenda for Economic Renewal, it proposed free trade. The consultations basically went on for about 2 years on that before they started making large changes. In the case of the new government in 1993, it was interesting because they put out the discussion document and then didn't take strong fiscal action in their first budget. And they got into a lot of public problems. They were really criticized. So they came back a year after that. So about a year and a half after they put out the document, and really tightened up fiscal policy dramatically. In fact, over a period of 3 years, they cut the level of government spending by 12%. Not just in real terms, in nominal terms. Wow. It was 100 billion, it went down to 88 billion. It was the only time in Canadian history, outside of right after the Second World War, that any government had actually lowered. And you know what happened in the election after that? After they did that, they won a majority.
Incredible.
So it was really interesting because in fiscal policy circles, it's always taken as a given, if you tighten up fiscal policy, it's terrible for you politically. And in Canada, every government tightened their fiscal policy in the mid-1990s, and every one of them got re-elected with a majority. And in fact, almost all of them got re-elected with a stronger majority than they had before they took the action. But why? You say, why did that happen? It's because they went through the trouble and made the Canadians understand that there was a problem, and hence action was going to be necessary. It's when the public doesn't understand the actions necessary that they object and then vote out the government. Welcome.
So how to make sure the public understands the urgency and inefficiency of current situation and the urgency of reform?
Well, and I mean, my experience, I had the privilege of, because I was in the government for a long time, I worked on both of those documents that are done by different levels of government. You have to be extremely transparent. I mean, you don't talk down to people, but you have to, it's tough for a bureaucrat because, you know, particularly economists, we tend to have our own language and it's technical. You can't do that. Yes. You got to speak really directly to people and say, here's where we are, here are the challenges, and here are some of our ideas for going forward. But, you know, you leave enough room in it for people to have input and so you can modify it. You don't say, we're going to do this, take it or leave it. No, that doesn't go very well. But you got to start a dialogue. Things are going to change.
In finance, you have been Assistant Deputy Minister of Tax Policy also and legislation. How important is the role of tax in this economy, in the economy that we talk about? And why I'm asking this question is, in Mongolia, employer never pays tax.
Yeah.
Employer pays for employee.
Right.
So in that way, employee doesn't feel that he's paying for all these costs. When in Canada, or was it like this before? When, if it is, then when you have changed it so that every individual pays taxes, so that the individuals is responsible for demanding the government to do the jobs?
We have had a personal income tax in Canada since 1917. It was introduced expressly as a quote-unquote temporary measure to pay for the First World War. Well, I don't know about the temporary part because we're now in 2000. In 3 years, it'll be around for 100 years. It's not going anywhere. It's our biggest source. What happened was, and this comes back again to this globalization context, we had quite high taxations on corporations, quite a bit higher than the United States and our other trading partners. And we realized by 1999 that we could not have a strong, globally open economy and have this high level of taxation, that corporations wouldn't come to Canada. And if an American company did come to Canada, they did everything they could to book their losses in Canada and book their profits in the United States. Yes. And so we just said, we got to change it. And we literally revolutionized the way we tax capital.
Which year?
We started in 1999, and it continued and it's interesting enough, it carried over two different governments, very different governments, but they both followed the same plan. We roughly cut our corporate income tax rates in half. And we had federal and provincial capital taxes, and we eliminated those.
What was the level before the cut twice?
The top corporate tax rate with the surtax in 1999 was 47%.
Wow.
And now in most of the provinces, this is combined federally and provincially, now in most of the provinces they pay 26 or 27%.
Way better than in the US.
It's actually lower than the US.
Then you have saw a lot in flow?
You know, I'd like to say yes, I'm not so sure, but I think we stemmed the outflow. At least we stopped that. I would like to say we brought in some others. I'm not quite sure that we've done that. But
my last question is on the situation in real estate. Now all bank loans are mostly concentrated in mining sector, real estate, and construction businesses, in these three.
Yeah.
And now the more the mining sector is becoming slow, the other sectors are also becoming slow. However, with the government program, they continue to build, though they are not selling.
Right.
What is the most likely scenario?
Well,
because the people cannot buy those, I mean, because people are poor and they cannot afford buying these houses, which is for upper, middle, or higher end consumers.
Well, you know, as a Canadian, having seen what happens to the U.S. housing market, your greatest fear are you creating the situation for a housing meltdown and a financial fallout like the United States? And I don't think that would happen here. First of all, people tend to have equity in the house they're buying. And I met with the CEOs of the banks here and also with the Bank of Mongolia, and I was surprised pleasantly how much capital the banks have. So we have new international standard for how much capital a bank should have, and all of the Mongolian banks are quite a bit above that. So I think there's a solidity to the banking sector here that certainly wasn't there in the United States in 2007 and 2008.
So you think it can survive this long-term, not slow sale of new apartments, which is not being sold?
Well, I think so, but just as the Mongolian economy won't grow as rapidly, then the revenue base for the banks won't likely grow as rapidly in the future as in the past either. But because their balance sheets are relatively solid, I think that the banks will remain solid here.
All right, on the very, very final thing is now 2011, 17% growth rate. We cannot maintain anymore. It goes down, and this year probably 6-7%. And with the current, you said this morning about being all global problem is synchronized.
Right.
Sort of. Then with the current not very high growth rate in China, things will go about that level, huh? What do you think?
You know, here's the great problem coming. So he asked me what Canada's going to grow by. I only need to know one thing. What's the U.S. going to grow by? And in your case, it's more difficult because you've got to know what's the environment for one industry, natural resources. And as we discussed, all it takes is small changes in global demand and supply, and the thing will wildly cycle all over the place. So it's very hard to say in the future 5% is sustainable growth rate, 3% is a sustainable growth rate. It could be flat some years, prices could firm, it could be 10%. I guess if you ask me for a guess, I would say over the next 10 years, the average growth rate is probably going to be in the range of 3 to 5%, a lot weaker. But we have to keep in mind, again, where we started, the global growth rate from 2000 to 2008 was not sustainable. And we're seeing a new lower global growth rate right now.
In either way, it sets new mode for Mongolian businesses and economy. So I think we are in the process of digesting this new reality in Mongolia. And I think your thoughts today have contributed to this thoughts in Mongolia. And I would like to thank you for your time and coming to Mongolia and sharing with us your interesting thoughts and experiences.
Oh, thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you very much.